Okay, that's a very good question. How would we explain that Old Testament saints were saved by Christ? Well, first of all, no one sins in any dispensation, if we want to use that type of terminology, in any age. No one's sins have ever been forgiven apart from the atoning work of Christ. So, as we understand from Romans chapter 3, you know, that passage that we always go to, let's just go to there for a moment. Romans 3:25, whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation in His blood through faith. This was to demonstrate His righteousness, because in the forbearance of God He passed over sins previously committed. For the demonstration, I say, of His righteousness at the present time, so that He would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. We see Old Testament saints with believing faith. And they were justified by that faith. But how can God justify them by their faith without an atonement? Without a propitiation? Well, that propitiation came in the person of Christ. So Abraham, every Old Testament saint that ever was reconciled with God, justified, and brought into the presence of God, brought into glory after death, every one of them, it was by virtue of the death of Christ. So all the Old Testament saints are in heaven only because of Christ. That everyone is in agreement on. Now, the next question is this. Were these Old Testament saints saved because they had faith in Christ? Now, some people would say that the Old Testament saints knew a lot more about the Messiah than we think they did. And that they were trusting in a Messiah who would come and die for them. I'm not so sure about that. I do believe they understood many things about the Messiah. But I don't think possibly their gospel was that clear. Because when Paul speaks about the gospel, when we understand the gospel in the New Testament, we understand that we have received a lot more revelation about the gospel than anyone's ever had in the New Testament through the person of Christ, His coming. And that the prophets of old were studying these things and examining these things to see what was going on. But they did not have the fullness of understanding that we have. Here's what I do know. Men have always been saved by believing what God has told them. Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, that faith led to justification. God could justify Abraham only because of the atoning death of Christ. But I do not believe that Abraham was saved because he believed everything about the gospel that I understand today. I believe he knew of the hope of a Messiah. I believe that he knew of the need of atonement. But to put everything together like we have today, I wouldn't go that far. So men have always been saved by believing the revelation they have received. So he believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Okay?